Irish, also referred to as Gaelic or Irish Gaelic, is a Goidelic language of the Indo-European language family originating in Ireland and historically spoken by the Irish people. Irish is spoken as a first language by a small minority of Irish people and as a second language by a rather larger group of non-native speakers. Irish enjoys constitutional status as the national and first official language of the Republic of Ireland, and is an officially recognised minority language in Northern Ireland. It is also among the official languages of the European Union. The public body Speakers.Irish is responsible for the promotion of the language throughout the island of Ireland. Irish was the predominant language of the Irish people for most of the recorded history, and they brought it with them to other regions, notably Scotland and the Isle of Man, where Middle Irish gave rise to Scottish Gaelic and Manx respectively. It has the oldest vernacular literature in Western Europe. The fate of the language was influenced by the increasing power of the English state in Ireland. Elizabethan officials viewed the use of Irish unfavourably as being a threat to all things English in Ireland. Its decline began under English rule in the 17th century. In the latter part of the 19th century, there was a dramatic decrease in the number of speakers, beginning after the Great Famine of 1845–52. Irish-speaking areas were hit especially hard. By the end of British rule, the language was spoken by less than 15% of the national population. Since then, Irish speakers have been in the minority. This is now the case even in some areas officially designated as part of the Gaelic-font. Efforts have been made by the state, individuals and organizations to preserve, promote and revive the language, but with mixed results. Around the turn of the 21st century, estimates of native speakers ranged from 20,000 to 80,000 people. In the 2006 census for the Republic, 85,000 people reported using Irish as a daily language outside of the education system, and 1.2 million reported using it at least occasionally in or out of school. In the 2011 census, these numbers had increased to 94,000 and 1.3 million, respectively. There are several thousand Irish speakers in Northern Ireland. It has been estimated that the active Irish language scene probably comprises 5 to 10% of Ireland's population. There has been a significant increase in the number of urban Irish speakers, particularly in Dublin. This community, described as disparate but large, well-educated and mostly middle class, enjoys a lively cultural life and has been linked to the growth of non-mainstream schools which teach through the medium of Irish in Gaelic-font areas. However, there has been a general decline of the use of Irish. It has been predicted that, within 10 years, Irish will no longer be the primary language in any of the designated Gaelic-font areas. Survey data suggest that most Irish people think highly of Irish as a symbolic marker of identity, but that few think of it as having a practical value. It has also been argued that newer urban groups of Irish speakers are a disruptive force in this respect, since their aim is to make the language a practical instrument of communication. Names in an Gaidelic. The name of the language is Gaelic. Before the spelling reform of 1948, this form was spelled Goidelic. Originally this was the genitive of Gaidhelg, the form used in Classical Irish. Older spellings of this include Goidelic in Classical Irish and Goidelic in Old Irish. The modern spelling results from the deletion of the silent DH in the middle of Goidelic, whereas Goidelic languages, used to refer to the language family including Irish, comes from Old Irish. Other forms of the name found in the various modern Irish dialects include Goidelic, Gaelic, Gaeliga, Gaidelig and Ulster Irish in Northern, Connacht Irish and Galen in Munster Irish. In Europe, the language is usually referred to as Irish, with Gaelic or Irish Gaelic used in some instances elsewhere. The term Irish Gaelic is often used when English speakers discuss the relationship between the three Goidelic languages. History. Written Irish is first attested in Offaly inscriptions from the 4th century CE. This stage of the language is known as Primitive Irish. These writings have been found throughout Ireland and the west coast of Great Britain. Primitive Irish transitioned into Old Irish through the 5th century. Old Irish, dating from the 6th century, used the Latin alphabet and is attested primarily in marginalia to Latin manuscripts. During this time, the Irish language absorbed many Latin words, including ecclesiastical terms. Examples are easpag from episcopus and domnich. By the 10th century, Old Irish had evolved into Middle Irish, which was spoken throughout Ireland and in Scotland and the Isle of Man. It is the language of a large corpus of literature, including the Ulster cycle. From the 12th century, Middle Irish began to evolve into Modern Irish in Ireland, into Scottish Gaelic in Scotland, and into the Manx language in the Isle of Man. Early Modern Irish, dating from the 13th century, was the basis of the literary language of both Ireland and Gaelic-speaking Scotland. Modern Irish, as attested in the work of such writers as Geoffrey Keating, may be said to date from the 17th century, and was the medium of popular literature from that time on. For the 18th century on, the language lost ground in the east of the country, partly because the British government discouraged its use in education, law and administration, partly because of the spread of bilingualism, a conspicuous example of the process known by linguists as language shift. It was a change characterized by diglossia and transitional bilingualism. By the mid-18th century, English was becoming a language of the Catholic middle class, the Catholic Church and public intellectuals, especially in the east of the country. English had a particular economic value for immigrants, especially females. Increasingly, as the value of English became apparent, the prohibition on Irish in schools had the sanction of parents. The Great Famine is seen as precipitating the final catastrophic decline. Once it became apparent that immigration to the United States and Canada was likely for a large portion of the population, the importance of learning English became relevant. This allowed the new immigrants to get jobs in areas other than farming. It has been argued, however, that Irish was not marginal to Ireland's modernization in the 19th century, as often assumed. In the first half of the century, there were still around 3 million people for whom Irish was the primary language, and the numbers alone made them a cultural and social force. Irish speakers often insisted on using the language in the law courts, and Irish was also common in commercial transactions. The language was heavily implicated in the devotional revolution, which marked the standardization of Catholic religious practice and was also widely used in a political context. Down to the time of the Great Famine and even afterwards, the language was in use by all classes, Irish being an urban as well as a rural language. This linguistic dynamism was reflected in the efforts of certain public intellectuals to counter the decline of the language. At the end of the 19th century, they launched the Gaelic Revival in an attempt to encourage the learning and use of Irish. Although few adult learners mastered the language, the vehicle of the revival was the Conrad na Gaeilge, and particular emphasis was placed on the folk tradition, which in Irish is particularly rich. Efforts were also made to develop journalism and a modern literature. Current status. Republic of Ireland. Irish is given recognition by the Constitution of Ireland as the national and first official language of the Republic of Ireland. Despite this, almost all government debates and business are conducted in English. In 1938, the founder of Conrad na Gaeilge, Douglas Hyde, was inaugurated as the first president of Ireland. The record of his delivering his inaugural declaration of office in Roscommon Irish remains almost the only surviving remnant of anyone speaking in that dialect. For the foundation of the Irish Free State in 1922, a degree of proficiency in Irish was required of all those newly appointed to the civil service of the Republic of Ireland, including postal workers, tax collectors, agricultural inspectors, etc. Proficiency in just one official language for entrance to the public service was introduced in 1974, in part through the actions of protest organizations like the Language Freedom Movement, although the Irish requirement was also dropped for wider public service jobs. Irish remains a required subject of study in all schools within the Republic which receive public money. Those wishing to teach in primary schools in the state must also pass a compulsory examination called Scrúdú Gaelach. The need for a pass in Leaving Certificate Irish or English for entry to the Garda Síochána was introduced in September 2005, and recruits are given lessons in the language during the 2 years of training. The most important official documents of the Irish government must be published in both Irish and English or Irish alone. The National University of Ireland requires all students wishing to embark on a degree course in the new federal system to pass the subject of Irish in the Leaving Certificate of GCSE examinations. Exemptions are made from this requirement for students born outside of the Republic of Ireland. Those who were born in the Republic but completed primary education outside it, and students diagnosed with dyslexia. New Galway is required to appoint people who are competent in the Irish language, as long as they are also competent in all other aspects of the vacancy they are appointed to. This requirement is laid down by the University College Galway Act 1929. For a number of years there has been vigorous debate in political, academic and other circles about the failure of most students in the mainstream schools to achieve competence in the language, even after 14 years. The concomitant decline in the number of traditional native speakers has also been a cause of great concern. In 2007, filmmaker Manchin Magan found few speakers and some incredulity while speaking only Irish in Dublin. He was unable to accomplish some everyday tasks, as portrayed in his documentary No Be Acute Arla. There is, however, a growing body of Irish speakers in the cities. Most of these are products of an independent education system in which Irish is the sole language of instruction. Such schools are known as Gael Scoiliana. These Irish medium schools send a much higher proportion of pupils on to tertiary level than do the mainstream schools, and it seems increasingly likely that, within a generation, habitual users of Irish will typically be members of an urban, middle-class and highly educated minority. Parliamentary legislation is supposed to be available in both Irish and English but is frequently only available in English. This is notwithstanding that Article 25.4 of the Constitution of Ireland requires that an official translation of any law in one official language be provided immediately in the other official language, if not already passed in both official languages. Gaeltacht. There are parts of Ireland where Irish is still spoken daily to some extent as a first language. These regions are known individually and collectively simply as the Gaeltacht, or in the plural as Gaeltacht, while the Gaeltacht's fluent Irish speakers, whose numbers have been estimated at 20 or 30,000, are a minority of the total number of fluent Irish speakers. They represent a higher concentration of Irish speakers than other parts of the country, and it is only in Gaeltacht areas that Irish continues, to some extent, to be spoken as a community vernacular. According to data compiled by the Department of Community, Equality and Gaeltacht Affairs, only 1/4 of households in officially Gaeltacht areas are fluent in Irish. The author of a detailed analysis of the survey, Donncha O'Healy of the Galway Mayo Institute of Technology, described the Irish language policy followed by Irish governments as a complete and absolute disaster. The Irish Times, referring to his analysis published in the Irish language newspaper Foinsa, quoted him as follows: "It is an absolute indictment of successive Irish governments that at the foundation of the Irish state there were 250,000 fluent Irish speakers, living in Irish-speaking or semi-Irish-speaking areas, but the number now is between 20,000 and 30,000. In the 1920s, when the Irish Free State was founded, Irish was still a vernacular in some western coastal areas. In the 1930s, areas where more than 25% of the population spoke Irish were classified as Gaeltacht. The strongest Gaeltacht areas, numerically and socially, are those of South Connemara, the west of the Dingle Peninsula, and northwest Donegal, where many residents still use Irish as the primary language. These areas are often referred to as the Fio Gaeltacht, a term originally officially applied to areas where over 50% of the population spoke Irish. There are larger Gaeltacht regions in County Galway, including Connemara, the Aran Islands, Carrara and Spiddle, on the west coast of County Donegal, and on the Dingle and Avera peninsulas in County Kerry. Smaller ones also exist in counties Mayo, Meath, Waterford, and Cork. Goidelic, County Donegal, is the largest Gaeltacht parish in Ireland. Irish language summer colleges in the Gaeltacht are attended by tens of thousands of teenagers annually. Students live with Gaeltacht families, attend classes, participate in sports, go to Sailith, and are obliged to speak Irish. All aspects of Irish culture and tradition are encouraged. Northern Ireland. Before the partition of Ireland in 1921, Irish was recognised as a school subject and as Celtic in some third-level institutions. Between 1921 and 1972, Northern Ireland had devolved government. During those years, the political party holding power in the Stormont Parliament, the Ulster Unionist Party, was hostile to the language. The context of this hostility was the use of the language by nationalists. In broadcasting, there was an exclusion on the reporting of minority cultural issues, and Irish was excluded from radio and television for almost the first 50 years of the previous devolved government. The language received a degree of formal recognition in Northern Ireland from the United Kingdom under the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, and then, in 2003, by the British government's ratification in respect of the language of the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages, while the British government promised to create legislation encouraging the language as part of the 2006 St Andrews Agreement, it has yet to do so. European Parliament. Irish became an official language of the EU on the 1st of January 2007, meaning that MEPs with Irish fluency can now speak the language in the European Parliament and at committees, although in the case of the latter they have to give prior notice to a simultaneous interpreter in order to ensure that what they say can be interpreted into other languages. While an official language of the European Union, only co-decision regulations must be available in Irish for the moment. due to a renewable 5-year derogation on what has to be translated, requested by the Irish government when negotiating the language's new official status. Any expansion in the range of documents to be translated will depend on the results of the first 5-year review and on whether the Irish authorities decide to seek an extension. The Irish government has committed itself to train the necessary number of translators and interpreters and to bear the related costs. Derogation is expected to end completely by 2022. Before Irish became an official language, it was afforded the status of treaty language and only the highest level documents of the EU were made available in Irish. Outside Ireland, the Irish language was carried abroad in the modern period by a vast diaspora, chiefly to Britain and North America, but also to Australia, New Zealand and Argentina. The first large movements began in the 17th century, largely as a result of the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland, which saw many Irish sent to the West Indies. Irish emigration to the United States was well established by the 18th century, and was reinforced in the 1840s by thousands fleeing from the famine. This flight also affected Britain. Up until that time, most emigrants spoke Irish as the first language, though English was steadily establishing itself as the primary language. Irish speakers had first arrived in Australia in the late 18th century as convicts and soldiers, and many Irish-speaking settlers followed, particularly in the 1860s. New Zealand also received some of this influx. Argentina was the only non-English-speaking country to receive large numbers of Irish emigrants, and there were few Irish speakers among them. Relatively few of the emigrants were literate in Irish, but manuscripts in the language were brought to both Australia and America, and it was in America that the first newspaper to make significant use of Irish was established. In Australia, too, the language found its way into print. The Gaelic Revival, which started in Ireland in the 1890s, found a response abroad, with branches of Conrad na Gaeilge being established in all the countries to which Irish speakers had emigrated. The decline of Irish in Ireland and a slowing of emigration helped to ensure a decline in the language abroad, along with natural attrition in the host countries. Despite this, a handful of enthusiasts continued to learn and cultivate Irish in diaspora countries and elsewhere, a trend which strengthened in the second half of the 20th century. Today the language is taught at tertiary level in North America, Australia and Europe, and Irish speakers outside Ireland contribute to journalism and literature in the language. There are significant Irish-speaking networks in the United States and Canada. Figures released for the period 2006 to 2008 show that 22,279 Americans spoke Irish at home. The Irish language is also one of the official languages of the Celtic League, which is a non-governmental organization that promotes self-determination and Celtic identity and culture in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Brittany, Cornwall and the Isle of Man, known as the Celtic nations. It places particular emphasis on the indigenous Celtic languages. It is recognized by the United Nations as a non-governmental organization with roster status, and is part of the UN's Economic and Social Council. The organization has branches in all the Celtic nations and in Patagonia, Argentina, New York City, US, and London, UK. There are many Irish speakers abroad, particularly in the United States and Canada. Irish was spoken until the early 20th century on the island of Newfoundland, in a form known as Newfoundland Irish. The following statistics were published in 2012. Of the 1.77 million who indicated stated they could speak Irish. 77,185 said they speak it daily outside the education system. A further 110,642 said they spoke it weekly, while 613,236 said they spoke it less often. 1 in 4 said they never spoke Irish. The numbers speaking Irish on a daily basis outside the education system showed an increase of 5,037 since 2006, from 72,148 to 77,185. The numbers of weekly speakers showed an increase of 7,781 persons, while those speaking Irish less often showed the largest increase of 27,139. To place those figures in context, the same report provided statistics for other household languages in Ireland.